right. Hi, everyone. My name is Deirdre. Welcome to the Murder Mindset. This is a podcast where we analyze true crime through neuroscience. And this is not to excuse the crime, but to understand the nervous system, the forces that shape behavior long before anyone picks up a weapon. During my graduate studies at Johns Hopkins, I focused on trauma, stress, environment, and neurodevelopment, and how different stressors and environmental factors literally wire the brain. Today, we're going to be diving into a case that's almost impossible to wrap your head around. A 15-year-old boy who broke into a home and stabbed a couple more than 120 times while they slept. This episode does include extreme violence, homicide, post-mortem mutilation, animal cruelty, self-harm, and severe mental health crisis. Listener discretion is advised. We're going to be tracing the warning signs, the fantasies, the escalating behaviors, and the neurobiology behind a mind that could experience reward from extreme violence. And understanding this doesn't make it okay. It doesn't forgive what happened, but seeing how the brain works in these situations can help us understand how rare, severe, and preventable some of these cases really are. If you are listening on Spotify or Apple or anywhere you get podcasts, if you follow us on Instagram at The Murder Mindset, I will be posting everyone involved in the case as well as on our TikTok. If you are on YouTube or anywhere else, please give this episode a thumbs up. Go ahead and follow, subscribe. It really helps out. Really helps other people find the content. And thank you guys all so much for being here. I'm really excited to dive into this episode. So before we get into the crime today, we need to meet the two people at the center of it. Oliver and Claudia. This isn't just a story of decline. This is about a couple who built a life of warmth, connection, and love. And to understand what was lost, we need to know who they were. So Oliver, also known as Chip Northrup Jr., was born in 1925 in Nebraska. He grew up in a culture where responsibility came early and character mattered. Friends described him as steady, humble, and trustworthy. He served in the Navy during World War II, and then he went to UCLA for undergrad and UC Berkeley for law school. And he dedicated his whole life to public service. He became a city attorney. He worked on the school board. He was a member of the community, his church. He was just really involved. And he also had another side of him. He was very artistic. He played guitar. He loved literature. And it's funny because he was actually in a band called the Puda Creek Crawdads. So we're going to get into this. He ends up moving and living and starting a home in Davis, California. And Davis is a really small town in Northern California. I am from Northern California. And so when I heard the name of the band Puda Creek Crawdads, I had to interject and laugh a little bit, because if you're from NorCal, or especially the town that I grew up in, you know about Puda Creek. I grew up in this really small town, and I'm talking the center of our town was our high school and our middle school. And when we were in middle school, I remember vividly, we would have field trips to go to the Puda Creek and look at the wildlife in the stream. I remember one of my first dates when I was a senior was hanging out with this guy at the Puda Creek, which I just think is so funny. I love the name of his band, the Puda Creek Crawdads, because it's just such a central Northern California thing, a small town thing. And I just feel you really have to love your town and where you're from, and you just really have to get that reference. So I had to highlight. He was an instrumental member of his band. He was a starting founder, actually. And he also had 4 children, and he became a grandfather. So he had a really full life. Children, grandchildren, career, extracurriculars, hobbies. And now we're going to look at Claudia Maupin. She was born in 1936, and her adult life showed us exactly who she was. She was warm, present, and attuned to those around her. She raised 3 daughters with steady love, guidance, and patience. And everyone that knew her just said that she brought such a warmth. She also had a big part at the Unitarian Universalist Church of Davis, California. And there she supported people through grief, illness, and crisis, quietly giving without seeking recognition. And so Oliver and Claudia meet at this church. They met in 1990, had a second chance of love. They were grounded in shared values, service, community, and they actually married in 1996. Claudia was 60 and Oliver was 71, and they blended their families and created a home full of warmth and laughter. If you think about it, meeting at that age in life after you've already, had a career, had children, had grandchildren, and you meet someone and you're like, this is my person, I want to get married, when you've lived such a full life, I feel like their connection must have been so special. And it's so it's very rare, I feel like, for people to not only get married a lot later in life, but especially after they've had so many different experiences. And I just think that really speaks of the kind of relationship that they had. So as I mentioned, their home was in Davis, California. And Davis is a really small town. It's close to Sacramento. Davis is known for when I think of Davis, I think of UC Davis. It's a really great college. And that's kind of the highlight of the town. So it's a very like friendly town. But when I say college, I don't mean college party town. People go there to study. It's a hardworking college. A lot of people go there to go into vet medicine. It's a beautiful town. It's in Northern California. Everyone rides their bike there. I feel like it's just like one of those towns you don't really know about unless you grew up there, you move there for school or work, and a lot of people end up staying there. I actually thought when I was in high school that I was going to go to UC Davis. I took a few tours of the campus and I absolutely fell in love with it. I did get in, but I ended up going to a different university, and my memories of Davis are just always fond. It's just such a great town. It's like you want to walk around, ride your bike. Like, there's so much youth. It's just such a community. Like, it's a very, very, very nice town. So Oliver and Claudia built their life in Davis, and it was really grounded in integrity, love, and purpose. It was a life worth knowing and a life that tragically was about to be interrupted. So a life like Oliver and Claudia's made the ordinary feel safe, which is why on the morning of April 14th, 2013, their absence immediately stood out. Oliver and Claudia did not show up for church that day, and that was really unusual for them. They were two dependable people. They communicated clearly, and remember, they were pillars in the church, pillars in the community. When they didn't show up for church, people noticed. Family members began calling them, but both of their phones went straight to voicemail. And it was a small detail, but again, for those who knew them, it was a warning sign. Like, something was just off. This is weird. What's going on? Why can't we get a hold of them? Later that afternoon, one of Oliver's children went to go check on him. And from the outside, he said everything looked normal. The curtains were drawn. Nothing was out of place. The car wasn't in the driveway. I believe it was in the garage. So he knocked on the door. No one answered. And he just was like, okay, maybe they stepped out. Their phones died. Something happened. Like, he really didn't think anything weird of it. And again, we're in Davis. This is a small town. Like, people walk around. People literally, like, they don't even walk in Davis. I feel like they just bike. Like, if you're from Davis, you know, it's so safe. Like, you can go out on your bike and you're just not worried. So when his son went to go visit him, didn't see anything out of the ordinary. The door is locked. He's not worried. However, a few hours later, still no one in the family can get a hold of him, and things just feel weird. And I think that's when Claudia's daughter goes over to visit. Like, she has this gut instinct that something is just really off. So she actually walks around the condo and she noticed something really weird. She noticed that one of the screens on the window had been cut, like, meticulously, just like a perfect square cut. And she already has like a really weird feeling, right? So she looks in the window and she noticed blood. That's all she sees, just like blood on the floor, nothing else. And her heart immediately sinks and she calls the police. Like, she doesn't even go in the window because she's just like, something is wrong. And I think it's one of those things where just instinctually every red flag is going off. Like, these are two people that are dependable. We know them. We can't get a hold of them. Something's wrong. She calls the police. So when the officers arrived, the first thing that they noticed was how normal the front of the house looked. The living room, the hallway, and the kitchen was untouched. There were no signs of forced entry, no overturned furniture, and no like open drawers. So whoever entered the house moved quietly and they headed straight to the bedroom because everything changed at the back of the house where their bedroom was. There was blood on the floor, and Oliver and Claudia were found together, killed during the night. And the lack of disturbance elsewhere suggested that they had likely been asleep when the attack had begun. It looked like it was swift, targeted, and defined, and detectives documented everything that they had noticed. The cut window scene marked the point of entry. Nothing had been taken. Nothing was out of place. All the cabinets and drawers were closed, and the rest of the house remained eerily intact, which was a very sharp contrast to the violence. To them, it didn't look like a robbery gone wrong. It looked like something intentional. So with no obvious motives, detectives started where they always do. They look at the family, they interviewed loved ones. They actually did zone in on Oliver's grandson. One of his grandsons had schizophrenia. And the detectives at this point thought, the more that they analyzed the scene, that this scene looked like it was driven by passion. And so aside from, family having a motive, they thought this looked like an emotional passion, like an emotional outburst. So they really zoned in on him. They eventually did clear him, but I do want to bring up that this whole case obviously traumatized the family and traumatized the grandson so much, but him being one of the main suspects, he actually unfortunately went on to unalive himself 3 years later, and the family believes that it directly was a result of this. So that was really sad, and I just kind of wanted to touch on that. But once the detectives cleared the family and they realized, this didn't seem like an inside case of motive, they canvassed neighborhoods. They asked if anyone had heard or seen anything, but no one had. And they collected DNA, fibers, fingerprints, and nothing matched anything inside the criminal database. So the case unfortunately stalled. This was the kind of town where doors were left unlocked and neighbors waved to each other. So a double homicide like this felt like it had come from another world. And because nothing about the crime fit familiar patterns, detectives were really left trying to make sense of violence that was both deliberate but also seemingly senseless. So it turned into weeks, leads dried up, anxiety rippled throughout the community, and everyone wanted to believe that it was random and that the person who did this would never come back, but the detective's instincts told a different story. This attacker hadn't panicked, he vanished, and when people disappear quietly, they often come back. So months passed into the investigation and it hit a dead end. There was no suspect, no motives, no answers. And then one day, a teenager named Alvaro Gararbe called into the station. He didn't sound like someone who was repeating rumors. He was careful and tense in choosing his words. And he told detectives that a friend of his had been talking about the murders in a way that felt disturbingly real. He called the station and he was able to repeat things that were very exact. And they were details that the police had never released to the public. So detectives listened closely and they brought him in for more questioning. The police say, okay, your friend that you're claiming that did this, call him. We're going to listen in on a line and see if we can get a confession. They call the friend and the friend doesn't answer. So obviously at this point, the police are like, okay, someone knows something because these are very specific details. It's either this boy that's coming in to the station or the person that he's claiming did it, which is his friend, but we have absolutely no evidence of that. This tip did change the investigation. It confirmed that someone with direct knowledge of the crime was talking about it. And that realization gave detectives a new focus. They knew the killer was someone within the community, someone who had lived through the crime and not just heard about it. They later learned that the person that Alvaro was talking about was a 15-year-old named Daniel William Marsh. Detectives brought Daniel in for questioning, but it wasn't an arrest. He was there voluntarily. He was invited to the station to talk, and at first they kept it casual. Small talk, open-ended questions, the kind of approach that lets investigators watch a teenager's natural reactions before he feels cornered. And he lived like a few doors down from where this crime had taken place. Almost immediately when they brought him in, something felt really off because most teenagers in a police interview, even innocent ones, show stress. But he didn't. He was very calm. His breathing was steady. His expression was neutral. And it was almost as if he was talking about school or homework instead of asking or questioning a brutal double homicide that had just happened close to where he lived. During these initial interviews, they didn't confront him directly. They just asked him about his knowledge of the crimes, general terms, his friends, his routines, anything that he observed that was out of the usual. And again, he's just super calm, which is very weird for a typical teenager. Like, think about it. When I'm driving and a police car comes behind you, and even though you know you're not speeding or doing anything wrong, it's a little nerve-wracking. So I can't imagine being called into a police station and just sitting there and being like, yeah, the sky is blue. I'm going to go out for ice cream later. No big deal. Just very, very weird. Over the next several days, investigators pieced together Daniel's background using public records that they could legally access. School files, counseling and crisis reports, medical summaries, and the publicly available information from his parents' divorce. They also looked at statements collected over the years from people who had been involved in his life. And when everything was laid out in one place, it became clear. There wasn't a single moment that broke him. It was a slow, layered unraveling. So the divorce records painted a picture of a home filled with conflict. His parents' marriage had been described as loud, tense, and unpredictable. And when his mother finally left, the fallout reshaped Daniel's world. New routines, new rules, and a new adult in the home. And that new partner was a woman. And it was actually someone who had once been Daniel's kindergarten teacher. A child that was already wrestling with anger and confusion, this shift was very sharp and destabilizing. Around the same time, those close to Daniel began noticing changes. After visits with his father, he would come home furious, repeating the same harsh language and hostility that he witnessed there. And his mother said that even though he had once been a thoughtful, sensitive kid, he didn't seem like that anymore. He seemed very volatile, withdrawn, and struggled to regulate emotions. I do want to make this clear that this information isn't from the mother because the police have brought her into the station. It's through the divorce files, which are public. They see that he went through this divorce. The mother is with a woman. It's a woman that he knows, his kindergarten teacher, and he's going back and forth between the parents' house. He has this sister. It's known at the time that the sister stayed with the mom, and then he stayed with the dad, and then it kind of switched off where he's with the mom and the dad. There's just a lot. There's a lot going on, and it's not a divorce itself that disrupts a child's development. It's what comes with it. So growing up in a home filled with constant conflict, unpredictable routine, or sudden changes in the adults a child depends on puts their brain in a constant state of stress. When stress stays high for months or years, it changes how a child regulates emotions, forms attachments, and responds to danger. Stability, emotional safety, and consistent support are what help a child cope and thrive, and without those, the brain starts adapting in ways that can make handling the world much harder. For Daniel, those protective factors were mostly absent. The fighting, the shifting loyalties, and the sudden change in his caregiving environment created a persistent sense of insecurity. Over time, that instability didn't just affect his behavior, it rewired the way that he processed stress, emotion, and threat. And his brain was actually learning survival first and safety second. So then came what psychologists will later call his first quote unquote morbid experience, the heart attack. Around age 12, Daniel was riding in the passenger seat with his father, and he suddenly collapsed. His father did while he was driving. And in an instant, Daniel's world flipped upside down. Daniel had to grab the steering wheel. He swerved out of traffic, crashed into a barrier to stop the car, and then he began pounding on his father's chest. He had no idea what he was doing. It's just instinctually what he thought was right. He essentially started performing chest compressions on his unresponsive father until his heart restarted. And on the outside, it looked like a miracle, and newspapers celebrated him as a local hero. He even received a Red Cross award, but his nervous system painted a very different story. A psychologist noted that Daniel described seeing his father in a quote-unquote dead state, and then the repeated praise and retelling didn't soothe the trauma. It actually cemented it for him. And this was a moment that should have been heroic, but instead it was layered on stress and responsibility that was far beyond his age. So not long after that, Daniel's mother's health started to decline. She was eventually diagnosed with fibromyalgia, which is a chronic condition that sometimes left her unable to handle basic daily tasks on her own. And on top of that, she struggled with her own mental health, experiencing periods of depression and emotional difficulty that made everyday life even more challenging. Records show that Daniel took on responsibilities most adults would struggle with, helping her to bathroom, getting dressed, cleaning up after her, and managing medical appointments. One physician summed it up bluntly: it was stressful for Daniel. So research on adolescents caring for chronically ill or mentally ill parents showed just how heavy that burden can be. Kids in these situations often experience higher levels of stress, anxiety, and depression, and the constant responsibility can disrupt normal emotional and social development. It doesn't mean that they're destined for serious problems, but when combined with other sources of instability like family conflict, exposure to trauma, and shifting household dynamics, it can overwhelm a young person's capacity to cope. And for Daniel, this really added another layer to an already complicated adolescence. So think about it. He's young. He's like 10, 11, 12, 13, dealing with a high conflict divorce, anger towards his mother's partner, and other stresses caring for a mother who struggled with physical and mental health. He was carrying a lot of adult responsibilities while still trying to navigate his own development, and his nervous system had been in overdrive for years, learning to survive rather than just simply being a kid. His physical health soon reflected the pressure on his nervous system because Daniel developed severe anorexia, dropping to around 93 pounds. He required intensive outpatient care, and eventually he was hospitalized. The trauma, emotional instability, caregiving responsibilities, violent thoughts, rapid mental health decline, the picture became clear. This wasn't a child who suddenly snapped. His brain and body had been in survival mode for years. Seen through this lens, the behavior in the interrogation room, his flat expression, steady breathing, visible lack of fear when he was brought in, wasn't confidence or defiance. It was a nervous system of someone who had been in a constant high stress environment. And Daniel's calm wasn't a moment, it was actually a trajectory. And once detectives understood the history behind it, that calm wasn't just unsettling, it was actually deeply alarming. When we talk about Daniel's childhood, the divorce, the household conflict, the early caregiving responsibilities, the trauma, it can be really tempting to draw a straight line from those experiences to his later actions. And that's not how human development works. So most kids who grow up in high conflict homes experiencing trauma or take on responsibilities don't end up committing violent crimes. What we know from research on neurodevelopment is that the brain is constantly adapting to its environment. Chronic stress, instability, and inconsistent caregiving can shape the way neural circuits develop, affecting emotional regulation, impulse control, and stress responses. But those environmental pressures are only one piece of the puzzle. We also have genetics, neurochemistry, and individual vulnerabilities interact in complex ways that we can't fully predict. So when we look at Daniel's trajectory, it's not about blaming his upbringing or saying that any child in a similar circumstance would follow the same path. It's just about understanding how multiple factors, environmental, biological, and psychological, converged over time. And that convergence is what shaped his nervous system, his stress response, and ultimately his behavior. This is why cases like this are so important from a neuroscience perspective, because they show us long-term effects of trauma and stress on a developing brain. And they remind us that understanding a mind in crisis requires looking at the full picture, not just a singular event or one singular influence. So I just wanted to make that clear. By 2010, Daniel's dark thoughts were starting to turn into real actions. It didn't stay in his head. Neighborhoods and friends later told investigators that he was stalking and killing neighborhood cats and other small animals. And this wasn't some random outburst or teenage tantrum. This was planned and deliberate. He even took pictures of animals and kept trophies. And when he talked about it, it was like he was telling a story, not confessing a crime. And psychologists identify repeated deliberate harm to animals, especially when done calmly and without remorse, as one of the most serious warning signs in a child. This behavior is actually part of what experts call the McDonald triad. And this was first proposed by psychiatrist J.M. McDonald in the 1960s. This triad identifies 3 early behaviors that when they appear together, they may, keyword may, signal a high risk for violent or antisocial tendencies later in life. Cruelty to animals, deliberately setting fires, and persistent bedwetting past the age when it's typically expected. And it's really important to note that this triad isn't a crystal ball, and not every child who shows these behaviors will become violent, but it does highlight significant issues in how empathy, guilt, and impulse control are developing. Essentially, the brain's normal stop signals aren't functioning properly, and behaviors that should trigger guilt or fear instead become normalized, rehearsed, or even rewarding. Basically, Daniel's brain was learning that causing pain didn't trigger alarm or guilt, and in some twisted way, it probably even felt exciting or satisfying. And that part of the brain that normally says, stop, this is wrong, was not working. So by practicing on animals, he was rehearsing violence safely. He was testing control, fear, and his own limits in ways that most kids or even adults would never even imagine. So it escalated. At night, he would ride his bike through the neighborhoods with a knife, looking for open windows, testing houses. And one night, he climbed into a home, moving quietly until a light went on. And most kids would have panicked, but Daniel ran, not because he realized what he was doing was wrong, but because he just didn't want to get caught. And it wasn't failure that stopped him. Failure sharpened his focus. Now we're just looking at a kid that doesn't have dark thoughts. He's experimenting, he's practicing, he's testing the boundaries of what he can do. And Daniel wasn't just spiraling, he was evolving. By the time detectives finished reviewing Daniel's psychological history, his detached behavior in the interview room no longer seemed mysterious. It fit a pattern. Muted fear, flattened affect, escalating violent thoughts, a growing link between violence and emotional relief. And none of this proved guilt, but it did mirror the behavior of someone seen at a crime scene, seen at that specific crime scene, which was controlled, deliberate, internally driven violence carried out without panic or remorse. So they had confronted him with the details and walked him through the inconsistencies in his story. They told him that a friend and his ex-girlfriend had actually come to the station and said, hey, this is what we heard firsthand. And when they first confronted him, he was in denial and he was still calm. And he literally says, I'm just a 15-year-old, or I'm just a kid. I could never do that. And then they start kind of going through the crime scene of what happens, and he actually starts correcting them, which is really creepy. And that's when we see small cracks starting to appear and his detachment beginning to strain. And eventually he starts to confess. So I, again, do want to give a trigger warning when we get into this confession. It's quite graphic. Daniel told detectives that he hadn't stumbled into the crime. He said that night he had gone to between 40 and 50 homes checking for unlocked doors and windows. And when he found the Maupin Northrop house, he climbed through an open window. Well, he cut the window, climbed through it, and he watched the couple sleep. And he described the attack with the same eerie calm that he had shown from the start. He admitted to stabbing them repeatedly, more than 120 times between both victims. And the way he talked about it was striking. He said he felt a rush. He called it amazing. He said it felt great. And there was no fear, panic, or loss of control. And you can actually find this police interrogation on the internet. I've listened to some podcasts where they drop the clip in there. I decided not to because it's really kind of like foggy and hard to understand him. I felt like the audio wasn't super clear. I will tell you, when I was listening to it though, I couldn't listen to it because I found it so disturbing. His voice annoyed me first and foremost, but it was the way he talked about it, like exactly how I'm describing it. It was so eerie and unsettling. And it was just like, I don't even know how to describe it. Like my brain can't even compute. He talked about it in such a normal, distasteful way that it's honestly hard to listen to. So if that is something that you're interested in watching, I will link one of the videos in the YouTube description so you can go ahead and check that out. But it's just terrible. So he goes on to explain what he did, and throughout this attack, he says that Claudia wakes up, she begs him to stop. He also states that he continued going. He ended up slashing her on the face and disfiguring her face and creating smile lines around her mouth. Then when he went over to Oliver, he tried to remove his eyelids as he was awake. As he's describing this, again, there was no fear, panic, or loss of control. He described it in the language of reward. And so from a neuroscience perspective, this is chilling. Normally, a brain experiencing violence or danger triggers cortisol, the stress chemical that sets off fear and alarm. And in Daniel's case, it was dopamine. This is the chemical tied to reward and pleasure. And it was surging. And violence didn't register as danger, it registered as stimulation. So detectives went further, trying to see where the violence was tied to, if it was just that night or if it lived inside him. And one of the detectives actually said to him, "If you wanted to kill me, how would you do it?" There was no pause. And this is also recorded in the interrogation. If you want to watch the video, again, it will be linked. Daniel immediately began listing methods: strangulation, using objects in the room, attacking by surprise. And then he analyzed them clinically, like he was problem solving, not confessing. Again, he was very calm, steady, no spike of anxiety or horror. And mind you, this is a kid who just committed to a crime. And then he's looking in an FBI's agent's eyes and saying, "Yeah, this is what I would do with you." And he's literally like, "Yeah, this is how I would do it." Like very matter of fact. And for detectives and later psychologists, this moment was as telling as the confession itself. It showed that his violent thinking wasn't situational. It was flexible, accessible, and almost like a toolkit in his brain. So violence wasn't something that he had done once. It was a way that he processed the world. So he went on to describe more of the crime. He admitted that after killing Oliver and Claudia, he mutilated their bodies, he removed their organs, and he did this because he just wanted to. He was curious to see what would happen. He also said that after they had passed away, he beat up their bodies to see how they would react, inserted objects into the bodies. There was a cell phone on the nightstand, and he put that in Claudia's torso, and he put a drinking glass that was on the nightstand into Oliver's. And these are acts that legally count as torture. And again, he said all of this without emotion, without panic, without remorse. He just explained what he did. I can hardly even recount this. I think I've had to go over this version and read it out loud like 4 or 5 times before I could record it, because the first time I came across this research, I was sick to my stomach. I can't imagine, thank God I can't imagine how someone could do something like this, but not alone do something like this and then retell it in a way that gives them pleasure. So he, in that interview, also admitted that he had fantasized about hurting people for years and that he thought about killing again, and that these weren't impulsive moments, they were matter-of-fact disclosures from his brain that was wired very differently. By the end of the interview, detectives didn't need to push further. He had given them everything, not out of guilt, but because talking about this seemed to bring him some kind of relief. When they left the room, the case had shifted. They weren't just identifying a killer. They were confronting a mind that could do something like this calmly, methodically, and without the reactions that we expect from most people. And this is where we are now going to really dive into the neurologics behind this case. So before we move forward, I do want to just pause for a moment, because what Daniel showed in the interrogation isn't just disturbing, it's extremely rare in someone his age. So most teenagers who commit serious acts of violence are reacting emotionally. They panic, they rage, they lose control. Their limbic system, which is the part of the brain that handles emotion, overwhelms the prefrontal cortex, which manages planning and self-control. And even if they try to downplay it, afterwards their bodies give them away. Trembling hands, rapid breathing, avoidance, tears, numb shock, their nervous system will still be in a crisis, okay? Daniel didn't show any of that. And that kind of composure points to something different. Instrumental violence, planned, deliberate, and internally rewarding violence. I just would like to highlight this because from a brain's perspective, this is huge. His amygdala, which is the fear center, was not the driver during the crime. Instead, it was his reward center. So areas like the nucleus accumbens were lighting up. And that's the same system that releases dopamine. That's the feel-good chemical that we experience during things like eating, winning, or sex. And that doesn't mean that he was destined to be a serial killer. Neuroscience doesn't predict destiny, but it does show risk trajectories. And Daniel's brain from a very early age was wired in a way that made violence feel rewarding. And that brings up a really uncomfortable question. What do we do with a child whose developing brain is literally wired to feel good doing something horrific? Drop your comment because I'm really curious to hear your thoughts. Once Daniel's confession was on the record, investigators turned to the physical evidence to see how it matched up with his story. What they found left little room for doubt. Oliver and Claudia had been attacked while asleep or just waking because they hardly had defensive wounds on their hands. There was nothing to suggest that they had time to react, and the injuries themselves were precise, fast, and forceful. Deep stab wounds to the torso, neck, and chest showed someone using a small, sharp blade with control and intention. And this wasn't random. He literally knew exactly what he was doing. Then there were the post-mortem injuries. And these were the wounds that were inflicted after the victims were already dead. And post-mortem mutilation isn't about panic or self-defense or anger. In forensic psychology, it's actually one of the clearest signs that violence, again, is serving an internal psychological function. Power, control, and even reward. And most people feel disgust or fear at the thought of harming a body. And again, for Daniel, all we see here is this pattern that it triggered excitement. And the crime scene told the story. Nothing was stolen. Nothing was ransacked. The house wasn't staged. Whoever went in had one goal: kill, mutilate, and leave. And that level of control is really rare for adolescents, especially first-time offenders. The medical examiner also noted a two-phase pattern. There was a burst of rapid violence, a pause, and then a return to one of the bodies. And that stop and start pattern suggests reflection, not frenzy, and control, not loss of control. So I bring this up because, again, all of this gets brought up in the trial, and it's really important to kind of understand this. Cases like Daniel's are actually incredibly rare. Most teenagers who commit these crimes, like I said, aren't calm. And what makes Daniel's so unusual is that at 15, he was demonstrating instrumental violence. Controlled, planned, and in his own words, internally rewarding. And the precision of the attack is honestly really never seen in someone his age. Forensic psychologists had only seen a handful of cases like this. And when it does happen, it's a really red flag because it shows that someone, just like the way that their brain is wired for reward, shows that they will repeat. And again, we're not saying, okay, he's going to be a repeat offender, but it is highly likely. Once Daniel Marsh's confession, demeanor, and the forensic evidence all aligned, the legal process moved quickly. He was charged as an adult, something California law allowed at the time, especially in cases involving multiple victims, torture, or lying in wait. So in 2014, he was convicted of 2 counts of first-degree murder with special circumstances and sentenced to 52 years in life. He was just 15 at the time of the murders, but due to the severity of the crime, he was tried as an adult, and under the laws in place at that time, the sentence meant that he would not be considered for parole, and the max that they could do was 52 years. And then California's approach to juvenile justice began to shift in the following years that followed. With the passage of Prop 57 in 2016, new laws emphasized rehabilitation and the science of adolescent brain development. And this is where this conversation, I think, gets really, really interesting. These changes opened doors for people who had committed crimes as minors to request courts to reconsider how they were charged and sentenced. And Marsh seized this opportunity. On February 22nd, 2018, the appellate court conditionally reversed his conviction and ordered a juvenile transfer hearing, giving him a chance to argue that under today's law, he would likely have been tried in juvenile court, potentially eligible for release in his mid-20s instead of serving a life equivalent sentence. But for the families of Oliver Northrup and Claudia Maupin, the possibility was devastating. They had clung to the belief that this deeply violent teenager would never walk freely in their community again, and now they're being told that his case might be reconsidered, not because of any new evidence, but because the laws had changed. In May 2018, a video appeared on YouTube, a TEDx-style talk recorded inside the Richard J. Donovan Correctional Facility. This is where Marsh was serving his sentence, and in the talk, this is a TED Talk, he is going on there and he spoke about this stage in prison where he framed himself as rehabilitated and asked viewers to think differently about people who commit crimes. And he literally said, quote unquote, "I come to realize that there's no such thing as evil people in this world, only damaged people." On its own, that sentence could sound almost compassionate, the kind of thing you might hear in a trauma-informed lecture on a mental health training. But coming from someone who had described killing as amazing and right, and who had mutilated 2 sleeping elders for the rush, it landed very differently. He was devastated and angry and hurt. They said that they couldn't even believe that he was allowed to post this video. It re-traumatized them. They did push to get the video taken down. From a distance, some people saw the video as an evidence of growth, but up close through the eyes of the victim's family and many experts, it looked like something else. So during the legal battles around his sentence, the court brought experts to review Marsh's records, and forensic psychologist Dr. Matthew Logan testified that Marsh met criteria for psychopathy, scoring 35.8 out of 40 on the Hare Psychopathy Checklist Revised, also known as the PCLR, most widely used tool for assessing psychopathic traits. So to put that in context, scores above 30 are considered in the psychopathic range in North America. And many notorious adult offenders score in the low to mid-30s. And they stated that Marsh's score was one of the highest, higher than Jeffrey Dahmer, which is absolutely insane. ACLR doesn't measure evil. It measures traits like superficial charm, pathological lying, manipulativeness, shallow affect, lack of empathy, lack of remorse, and a tendency to use others as tools. And in Daniel's case, Dr. Logan and others highlighted all of these features. They described him as a quote-unquote clever, manipulative psychopath, noting that people with scores this high often function well in structured environments like prison, following rules, saying the right things, even sounding reflective, but they still possess a serious risk if released. And this is so important because highly psychotic individuals can present as calm, articulate, and emotionally insightful. They can speak about trauma and harm like what he was doing on his TEDx talk and make that sound intelligent and empathetic. But internally, this language is often a tool to influence, manipulate, or gain trust. When Daniel stood on that prison stage and gave that TEDx talk and said that there's no evil people, only damaged ones, the statement lands on 2 levels, right? So on the surface, it echoes a trauma-informed lens. Like, people who commit harm often do have histories of harm themselves, but given his history and his score, it also raises the question, is this true insight or is this a calculated impression management? And we know from his own words that he said the killings felt amazing, right, and great. He described a rush, and the crime scene itself showed deliberate and contained brutality, which was reward-driven, not violence or panic. And after his conviction, he still tested near the top of the psychopathy scale. So put together, the TEDx talk starts to look a lot less like a personal breakthrough and more like a textbook example of what a high-scoring psychopathic person does, which is adopt the language of accountability without truly feeling it. And I really bring this up because when he does his retrial, he goes into the court and he talks about, X, Y, and Z. And the family members say there's no point where he looks at them. Like, he can say all of the textbook things, But one of the daughters is like, you can't fake empathy. He never looks at us and he never once is like, I did this, I'm sorry. Like instead it was more like, I learned my lesson and I was hurt and I was broken. And when I listened to that, I was like, that's a really interesting point. Like you can get up on stage, give a TED talk, sound cunning and manipulative and say all the right things. And you can fake that, but you can't fake empathy. And I feel like if you can't look in someone's eye and be like, hey, I did this, I'm sorry, and like, let me connect with you on a human level, it's like that level of human remorse is just simply not there. The court, after reviewing his own words about the rush and reviewing the sentence and, going into the new law, and looking at his high score, they determined that this risk was actually not theoretical and it was ongoing. So judges actually ruled that Marsh remained too dangerous to be treated as a juvenile under updated laws, and his original sentence was upheld. As it stands, he won't be eligible for parole until 2036. For the families, this wasn't victory, it was survival and the bare minimum to feel safe. In California, laws are constantly changing, so right now, as of today, he is not eligible until 2036, but that could change at any point. His case sits inside one of the most difficult questions in both law and neuroscience. What do we do when a juvenile brain develops not toward rehabilitation, but toward greater violence? And it's really interesting because the family also speaks about, this law that came into effect, which is rehabilitating juveniles. And that's an important thing. And there's a lot of people serving for crimes that are much lesser, right? But this case, and that's why I think you need to look at cases very individually, is very, very different, and all of the factors surrounding it. And I don't even mean just like his childhood and, like chemical imbalances and environmental, just the way that he reacted, the way that he committed things, the way that he had planned to do them again. And it's also another interesting question, when we look at notorious serial killers back in the 60s and 70s, and they were getting away with things and not getting caught because we didn't have, cameras and evidence and technology and DNA and things like that. And we always wonder, if those killers were caught early, how many lives would have been saved? And it's interesting because it's like, is Daniel one of those? Could be a notorious serial killer, but he was caught early. But then, when those laws come into place and you're like, oh, he's a juvenile, maybe we should reassess his case and let him go. And we want to believe that people can be rehabilitated. Is this a case of someone that would be let go and then re-offend? So there's a lot of like moral debate on this case. It's very interesting. And people are not born killers, but some are born with neurological vulnerabilities that, when combined with trauma, instability, and unresolved violent fantasy, can shape a very rare and dangerous developmental path. And in Daniel's case, we saw 5 threads converge. 1, a blunted stress and fear response even under interrogation. 2, reward circuitry activated during violence, not inhibited by it. 3, years of depression, self-harm, and suicidal ideation and severe anorexia. 4, violent fantasies that should have triggered crisis level intervention. And 5, chronic family conflict and instability during brain development. No single factor explains a double homicide, but layered together over the years, unnoticed or untreated, they created a trajectory that was both escalating and invisible until the worst possible moment. What makes this case especially tragic is not just what Daniel did, it's how many chances there were to see what was coming and how those chances never connected. There were warning signs that were scattered across different systems: school, mental health providers, hospitals, home life, and no single institution had access to his full history, and each person saw only one slice of the problem. The depression, the anorexia, the self-harm, the numbness, the violent fantasies, but not one provider had that full constellation of symptoms in front of them. And if they had, the severity of his decline would have been much harder to miss. And by the time investigators and experts reconstructed his history after the murders, the pattern was undeniable. Oliver Northup and Claudia Maupin were anchors in their town. They spent their lives serving others, building relationships, and nurturing the kind of world that holds people together. And their deaths weren't just violent, they were senseless, preventable, and the direct result of a system that saw symptoms, but never the full story. So when you zoom out, the hardest truth is also the simplest. Daniel Marsh was not born to kill. His brain developed toward violence over the years, shaped by vulnerabilities that he did not choose, reinforced by fantasies that he did not understand, and left unchecked by systems that weren't built to recognize a pattern this complex until it was too late. Once his brain reached that point, once violence became rewarding instead of terrifying, the tragedy in Davis became almost inevitable. But inevitable is not the same as excusable. Understanding the brain behind a crime does not soften the harm, and it doesn't lessen the loss. It doesn't rewrite what Oliver and Claudia endured. But what it does do and what it has to do is force us to ask a different question. How many tragedies happen not because someone is evil, but because no one saw their unraveling clearly enough or early enough to stop it? If we want fewer cases like this, fewer families destroyed, fewer communities traumatized, fewer teenagers whose brains drift toward violence unchecked, we have to shift our focus and we have to start paying attention before the crime and not just after. This means building systems that communicate across time and institutions, systems that don't treat each crisis as a separate event, but track patterns as they unfold, and systems that treat early psychological decline with the seriousness it deserves, especially when it's paired with violence, numbness, and relief, because the brain does not simply snap, it rewires. And if we don't intervene while that rewiring is happening, we're left responding only when the damage is already done. This case will follow the community of Davis for decades. It will follow the family who loved Oliver and Claudia for the rest of their lives, and it should follow the same systems that failed, not as punishment, but as a reminder that lives depend on our ability to see these patterns early. Thank you for listening to The Murder Mindset. In our next episode, we will continue exploring the intersection of trauma, neurobiology, and criminal behavior, and take a closer look at what happens when the brain becomes the first crime scene long before anyone realizes that the crime is coming. You can follow us on Instagram, TikTok, and anywhere you get your podcasts, Spotify, Apple, YouTube. And if you enjoy the show, please leave a review, follow, or drop a comment. It really helps us reach more listeners. Our next episode will air December 27th, and I can't wait to dive deeper with you. Thank you guys all so much for being here.